Greetings, booktubers. Welcome back to Grammaticus Books. Welcome to an episode of Grammaticus Books where we're going to go over the worst foreword that has ever been written for a book. Now, if you have a foreword that you think is god-awful, please put it down in the comments section. I'd love to read about it as well. But the foreword here today is just one of the most, it's the worst foreword that I've ever read. And I would be hard-pressed to imagine that there could be another foreword out there somewhere in existence that contains as much hubris and arrogance and is such an affront to the reader as the foreword contained in this book right here, And Their Memory Was a Bitter Tree. This is a collection of 8 Robert E. Howard stories that were put together in 2008 by Tim Underwood and published by Black Bart Press. Now, what makes this foreword so egregious, what makes it such an affront on the sensibilities of the reader, is because the author of that foreword, Arnie Fenner, in that foreword goes after Robert E. Howard himself. He attacks Robert E. Howard's character as a person. He attacks Robert E. Howard's literary character, Conan the Barbarian, and he goes after Robert E. Howard's qualities and abilities as a writer inside of his foreword in a book celebrating the works of Robert E. Howard. It is just absolutely mind-numbing. It's astounding. But Arnie Fenner doesn't limit himself to just going after Robert E. Howard. Oh no, he expands his critiques, he expands his attacks and his criticisms, and includes Frank Frazetta, the legendary artist Frank Frazetta, whose work is also contained in this book. Here on the back cover, you get this wonderful painting by Frank Frazetta, and the interior of this book has a number of paintings by Frank Frazetta that they included in order to illustrate and bring to life the stories here contained in the book. Let me find one of those fabulous paintings. Like this one right here. Just fantastic stuff. And there's 7 or 8 Frank Frazetta paintings contained in this book. So Arnie Fenner goes after the legend Frank Frazetta after attacking Robert E. Howard. And then he doesn't stop there. He goes for the complete trifecta and he takes pot shots at Roy Thomas. Roy Thomas, the comic book editor, writer, and adapter of numerous Conan novels at Marvel Comics. And it is just astounding. Like I said, it absolutely boggles the mind that Arnie Fenner would take this tact in this foreword here, in this book, And Their Memory Was a Bitter Tree. And it's really a shame because notwithstanding the foreword, this is actually a very, very good book. It's an excellent collection of Conan books here. The quality, the physical quality of the book itself is very good. It has great pages in it of high gloss paper, a nice stitched binding on it. You've got this wonderful painting here on the front by Brom of Conan the Barbarian and Belit, Queen of the Black Coast. The title up here, And Their Memory Was a Bitter Tree, is actually a line out of the story, The Queen of the Black Coast. And like I said, the quality of the paper is fantastic. You've got 8 stories that are some very good collections of Robert E. Howard stories, including the gems, The Queen of the Black Coast, A Witch Shall Be Born, The People of the Black Circle, Red Nails. I mean, those are just, all 4 of those are just excellent, excellent Robert E. Howard stories. You have a wonderful interior map of the Hyborian Age, and you've got an interior painting by Brom of the cover as well. And so this is just an excellent edition of Robert E. Howard's Conan stories that Arnie Fenner attacks the character of Robert E. Howard and a number of other people in this book. And it just really is jaw-dropping. So I know what you're saying. Who is this Arnie Fenner who wrote this atrocious foreword? And that's also a question that I asked myself after I finished reading his foreword here in this book. And Arnie Fenner is a commercial artist. He did CD album covers. He did the artwork to CD music CDs. He also did the artwork to numerous book covers. And he was the art director at Hallmark's card division for a number of years. But what other quality would you have? What are the qualifications would he have for Tim Underwood, the person who assembled this book, put it together, to hire him in order to do the foreword? Well, back in 1975, his only other qualification is that Arnie Fenner put out a fanzine with at least a couple of issues back in 1975. And those are his sole qualifications for doing this foreword here in this book, And Their Memory Was a Bitter Tree. But let's go into it. Don't take my word for it. I'm going to read to you the passages in here where he goes after these people, where he goes after Robert E. Howard, where he goes after Frank Frazetta, and he goes after Roy Thomas. So let's go through it. So here on page 2 of the foreword, is where you get your first hint that something may be amiss, that everything is not quite kosher. And Arnie Fenner writes, how much of Howard's life story is truth and how much self-manufactured tall tale is open to conjecture. And most of what we know, the word know in quotation marks, about him comes from his letters and autobiographical essays, but little is substantiated by witnesses, official records, or his handful of friends. And that's the first indication that something's wrong. And what he's doing here is he's taking a shot at Robert E. Howard's character. He's taking a shot at his credibility because he has to prep the battlefield being the mind of the reader, in order to lay doubt within the mind of the reader that maybe something's all not right with Robert E. Howard, so that he can then slowly, inch by inch, tear him down before he launches his major assault here for the mind of the reader and goes after the writings of Robert E. Howard himself. So he's sort of prepping the battlefield here with this opening salvo. He follows that one up with, but more questionable are his own claims of holding a laundry list of disparate jobs, of having to carry a pistol to ward off a host of unnamed enemies, or of being an unbeaten participant of back alley Iron Man fights. Friends disputed Howard's tales of being bullied in his youth. No one has been able to support any of his assertions regarding assassins, waiting in ambush, and photographs of Robert show him as an unscarred, well-fed, and not terribly muscular young man. Certainly not the bare-knuckle brawler he alleged to be in his correspondence. He was the only one who seemed to be aware of his reputation for toughness. And again, this is Arnie Fenner just continuing and turning up the volume here on the personal attacks, the ad hominem attacks upon Robert E. Howard in order to tear him down so that he can then launch attacks on his writing qualities. And that's on page 3. He then goes on to go after Robert E. Howard's creations, his world, the world of Hyboria, and also Conan the Barbarian. So on page 4, you get Robert described the geographical setting of his Hyborian age as that of our Earth, but in an alternate or fictional past circa 14,000 BC to 10,000 BC. And he filled it with all manner of countries, races, monsters, and sorcery of the blackest sort. Howard mashed and mixed various societies and periods of history to create a setting in which medieval knights could fight his version of Vikings or Elizabethan pirates on one border, and thinly disguised Native Americans or Egyptians on the other. So he's sort of implying at this point, not sort of, he's outright implying that Robert E. Howard's Hyborian age is basically just name swapping for European middle-aged European countries. He's just swapped out the names of England and France and Spain and put them here into his Hyborian world as Aquilonia, Poitou, Zingara, and Stygia as ancient Egypt. And there's a small kernel of truth to that, but it actually misses the point. What Robert E. Howard was writing about is he was writing about a world that existed previous and prior to those nations coming into existence. And all these societies that he's writing about, these countries, they were the precursors to those countries that would then come about 10 to 14,000 years later. And he imbued them all with their own characteristics, their own flavors, their own gods, their own customs, and made it his own. And Arnie Fenner in here deliberately misses that, in my opinion. It just either went right over his head, or he's deliberately misrepresenting it here. And again, he's moving now from attacking Robert E. Howard's personal characters into going after his creation of the Hyborian Age and Conan the Barbarian. At this point in the forward, Arnie Fenner then goes after Frank Frazetta, the legendary Frank Frazetta, where he describes his art as primeval. Now, when he says primeval here in this forward, what he's referring to is like a savage energy in it. But as a fellow artist, Arnie Fenner, as a commercial artist who does book covers, it's a bit of a backhanded compliment. And then he follows that up in here by saying that Frank Frazetta, when he was doing his paintings, however they had this savage energy, that they didn't actually represent the descriptions as written in the books by Robert E. Howard. He says they really weren't faithful to what Robert E. Howard was writing in the books, and he did his own take on it. He put his own spin on it to change them to where they were almost unrecognizable from the stories written by Howard. But then you've got these, again, these are just fantastic paintings. Here's Conan of Samaria from The Frost Giant's Daughter. I mean, it's exactly as described in The Frost Giant's Daughter. Here you have the cover to Conan #1 from Ace Lancer with a scene from Rogues in the House that's right out of the book. You've got this cover here from the Scarlet Citadel. This is an exact scene out of the Scarlet Citadel. And then the last one you have Beyond the Black River with a depiction of Conan fighting the Picts that could be right out of any scene there in the book. So it rings false, it rings hollow. And then lastly, he attacks Frank Frazetta's character, saying that Frank Frazetta claimed total credit for all the sales of these Ace Lancer books due to his artwork. And while there might be a kernel of truth there in that, there might be a grain of sand of truth in it, why in God's name would you state that in your foreword in a book where you are using Frank Frazetta's artwork in order to promote your book here, A Memory, and Their Memory Shall Be a Bitter Tree, and to use his paintings in order to illustrate and bring to life these fabulous stories by Robert E. Howard. Such as this painting right here from Conan the Wanderer. It's spiteful, and I don't understand why he did it. Although I have a theory on that, and I'll get to that at the end of the book here. So after going after Robert E. Howard and Frank Frazetta, he then decides that he's going to take a shot at Roy Thomas. And Arnie Fenner writes the following. A work that Howard had created for other genres was revised and became new additions to the Conan saga. Roy Thomas's rewrites were more extensive than DeCamp's and arguably worse, as he adapted almost any sword and sorcery story he could license for Marvel's Conan comics. Soon, a purist sensibility began to exert itself among fans, quietly and firmly encouraged by Howard's literary executor for many years, Glenn Lord. So he says that Roy Thomas is a worse writer and a worse editor and adapter than L. Sprague de Camp, which is just ludicrous. Roy Thomas's adaptations of the Conan stories were absolutely wonderful. His adaptations in The Savage Sword of Conan are some of the best adaptations of Conan stories that have ever been done. But at this point, what Arnie Fenner is doing, he's also setting the stage for why this version of the book is going to be the best version of the book, where he talks about that purest vision. And then he goes on to mention Carl Edward Wagner's 1977 editions of Conan stories that he put out in this 3-volume set right here. And what Carl Edward Wagner did, and Arnie Fenner references here in his foreword, is that Carl Edward Wagner in these 3-volume set with these fantastic Ken Kelly covers, what he did is he went back to the original stories as they were published originally in Weird Tales back in the 1930s. These aren't the original manuscripts. They were edited, but they were edited with a much lighter hand than L. Sprague de Camp did in his Ace Lancer series, and they were edited by Farnsworth Wright, who was the editor of Weird Tales at that time. And he's setting this up here as the reason for why this book has been published in the format that it's been published in. But now he has set the stage, he has prepped the battlefield for his final assault, and he takes his last attacks here on Robert E. Howard's writing abilities. Then, at the turn of the century, Wandering Star published a handful of beautifully illustrated collections of Howard's work, some of which were reprinted into softcover by Del Rey, featuring the original versions of REH's stories from his manuscripts, unedited and with his suggested titles restored. These were intended to be the definitive, untainted works of Robert E. Howard, the assumption being, of course, that Robert E. Howard didn't need editing, not by Wright, de Camp, or anyone else. A questionable assertion, because while Robert certainly was a tremendously gifted storyteller with a wholly original voice, capable of spinning an exciting yarn and first draft that could capture his reader's imagination, he simply wasn't a great writer. And there you have it. The reason I think that Tim Underwood, the editor and the person who compiled this book here and put it together, the reason he got Arnie Fenner to write that is because he had to deal with the 2003 editions by Del Rey of the original manuscripts, unedited with the original titles by Robert E. Howard, that are so fantastic. And he wants to make a case that the edited version, his version, is better in order to sell his version, his book here, over these that were done by Del Rey in 2003. And I think that is why you get the tone and the hubris and the attacks and the spitefulness that comes into here, the sheer effrontery that is contained in that foreword by Arnie Fenner. The reason for it is because they have to promote this version, which goes back to the original publications by Weird Tales with the edits by Farnsworth Wright that are contained within it, versus the unedited manuscripts by Del Rey. So he's making a case why his book is better. So he's selling his book. This is what I think is going on here. And then on the final page, what Arnie Fenner then does on the final page is that he promotes Farnsworth Wright's edits as the definitive version of Conan the Barbarian. And he writes the following. Farnsworth Wright was a good editor for Robert E. Howard, and he puts good in italics in order to offset it and bring attention to that word. Not only did he give REH his first national exposure, he also nurtured him as a writer. His suggestions and changes and edits improved Robert's work and helped him to mature and become a better craftsman. And it should be noted that Howard himself never voiced any serious complaints about Wright's editorial direction. So in many ways, the published versions of the Conan tales are the definitive versions. And that's the purpose of this collection. And that's the purpose also of this foreword, is to promote this as the definitive version in contrast to this version here by Del Rey, which is the unedited manuscripts. Now, the most eloquent riposte, the most eloquent counterpoint to this foreword here by Arnie Fenner, which I'm sure Tim Underwood approved. I can't imagine that he didn't read it and approve it and put it into here. The most eloquent counterpoint is, in fact, these Del Rey books here that were put out in 2003 that are the original unedited manuscripts by Robert E. Howard, because they're absolutely wonderful. And they speak for themselves, and they can reply to Arnie Fenner's foreword much more eloquently than I can. But that is it. That is the world's worst foreword that I've ever read. My jaw was hanging open when I finished reading that foreword here when I first got this book a number of years back. But I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts on it. Put it down in the comments section below. Let me know what you think of it. Let me know if you've got another foreword that is equally as atrocious as the one written here by Arnie Fenner. And with that, I'm going to wrap this one up. And I'm going to say take care, be safe, and I will catch you guys next time.